So let's get started with the first speech engaging with how to achieve healthy societies. And we'll see an insight from India, as well as from Latin America and East Africa, Southern Africa. So it will be a nice reunion around that theme, and it will be moderated by Rene Loewenson.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, and hello, everybody. It's great to be here. I listened yesterday to some of the sessions. It was really instructive and fascinating, and I'm very honored to have an opportunity to share some of the work that we've been doing and perhaps some of the insights. I'm going to share screen so that hopefully you can see a presentation. Can you see that? Is that all okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, brilliant. So I think as you mentioned, some of what I'm going to talk about today is drawn from work that I did together with Eugenio Villar from Latin America, Rama Baru from India, Robert Martin from the Alliance for Health Policy and Systems Research, that sort of looked at the historical trajectories of how we understand healthy societies. It is documented in a paper, and I can happily share the website for that paper. But I'm also going to draw on some of the other work that we've been doing around comprehensive public health and around looking at social engagement, particularly in response to COVID, and generally on my own experience of working in East and Southern Africa and internationally. So it'll move across a number of different ideas, and I'm happy to share some documents that are relevant for further reading. So I think we're sort of in a forum where we're talking about international health or what's called global health sometimes, and particularly I heard yesterday about how much the sort of local issue is being affected by the global level, and the need to connect local action with global action. And in this kind of a forum, I guess one of the questions to ask is whose health is global health? I mean, who are we? Whose ideas of health are coming through in the way we discuss this issue? I'm also going to raise a bit about why we need to recognize diversity, circulation of ideas, and indeed contestation between ideas, if we want to move forward in thinking about how to engage with healthy societies. And then a little bit of a reflection on where to next. So I know that we're focusing on solutions spaces rather than problem spaces, but I think it's really important to kind of keep in mind the profound global inequality within which we're discussing these issues. In wealth distribution, if you look at the blue zone of the top, millionaires and their command of just nearly half of global wealth, the bottom 50% of the global population with less than 1% of global wealth. And this expresses in multiple ways that I think you've been discussing yesterday, and will come through today, I'm sure, again, in terms of basic rights that are essential for health, such as in food security. And you can see in the global map, the regions in blue and green that are more food secure with those that are not. And the irony of most food producing regions being the most food insecure, this huge disconnect between production and consumption that's taking place in the nature of the current global economy. Also, and you talked a lot about this yesterday, in the harms from climate, such as from the CO2 emissions, which countries are generating the most, with the countries in red showing that, but also who experiences the burdens of this, and the almost inverse picture of the countries with least contribution to the harms experiencing the greatest degree of the burdens. So it's really important that as we think about healthy societies, we not homogenize away from this understanding that the lived experience of our current global economy is very different for different people. I think that we've seen this in the consequences of COVID, and Oxfam have called COVID the SARS virus that's caused COVID, the inequality virus, because they've pointed out that the number of people in poverty rose in 2020, in the period of the pandemic, by 200 to 500 million, and that this will take about 10 years to recover if we don't make changes in the way we produce and consume, and in the current nature of our systems. At the same time, the 10 richest billionaires' wealth grew since the crisis by 3.9 trillion. In fact, there was a dip that recovered very quickly in 9 months. So what we're seeing is this K-shaped widening inequality as a result of crises such as pandemics. And of course, we are seeing it now in what the WHO Director General has called the catastrophic failure in access to health technologies such as vaccines, a subject which has been right at the top of social mobilization, and in fact is affecting many negotiations taking place today with the World Trade Organization Council meetings beginning to take place. And what you can see is that this crisis has been also an opportunity for wealth accumulation. That what it's meant for some parts of the world that have controlled production is that they have resisted the possibilities of changing the global rule system set by the WTO to enable countries to have more distributed production of these health technologies. Indeed, there's been some shift on this, principally because of the combined coalition of states from the South and from populations and parliaments to press for the TRIPS waiver, as it's called, to open up intellectual property more widely, and also to look at the way finances flow to enable production to grow within the South. In the last 24 hours, I think that we've heard that even the European Union, which has been one of the most strong contenders against the TRIPS waiver, has begun to recognize perhaps the need to enable it for vaccines, but the proposing countries have said that compulsory licensing for vaccines is not sufficient, and that it also needs to cover the testing technologies, the diagnostics, and the medicines in a much more comprehensive approach to managing the public health consequences of COVID. So despite a process of donations, what we're seeing is that COVID has in fact entrenched these global inequalities because of the kind of global rule systems that it's operating within. And it's very interesting that there has been a paper produced by Piketty and Chantal about the way this kind of inequality has grown over the past 2 centuries. It's a fascinating paper, it's worth reading. Mapping income, tax, and other sources of data from countries globally, adjusting for countries which have poor data systems, but essentially showing that the colonial imperial expansion in the 1820s and 1910s was a period of significant growth of inequality between countries globally and within countries, and that this was consolidated in the early 1900s as propertied classes were given the benefits of legal changes, rules changes within domestic and international economic systems to make sure that that rule system supported existing wealth. In the 1920s to 1980s, they've mapped a decline in within country inequality, contributed to by the movement towards socialist economies in Eastern Europe, as well as indeed in some parts of Latin America, but also the social welfare, social democratic reforms in Europe post-World War II. And indeed, some of the reforms that began to be introduced post-independence by liberation movements in different parts of the world. That within countries enabled some distribution of the benefits from economic growth. But in fact, between countries, the inequalities continue to grow because the rule systems continue to favor the countries which had already accumulated and amassed wealth as a result of the systems in place. And that there wasn't much change in that. And what we've seen in the 1980s is in fact a reversal of the decreases as austerity, structural adjustment, neoliberalism has increased within country inequalities. There has been indeed some plateauing of between country inequalities, but largely contributed in this paper. They report due to China and the Southeast Asian economies, and the creation of perhaps a more multipolar global economic world. I think one of the points they raise is that these contradictory and compensating evolutions have meant that actually early 21st century neo-colonial capitalism has involved similar levels of inequality as early 20th century colonial capitalism, even though it's based on a transformed set of rules and institutions. So we haven't made much progress, and we need to get to the causes of the causes, but also, and this is important, that the redistribution of incomes and capital within countries is becoming increasingly paramount to reducing global inequality, as the inequalities are contributed by particular elites and transnational capital within countries, and that this is actually affecting the populations within high-income countries as well as within low and middle-income countries. So there is a sense of accumulating disadvantage. And what's going to happen post-2020, they say, will depend on how we actually tackle with these kind of causes. And I'm just going to give an example of this. So if you look at tax losses and their consequences, and this comes from a very interesting report by the State of Tax Justice from the Global Tax Justice Network, we find that 483 billion has been lost globally due to direct tax abuse. And this is the abuse largely from multinational corporations implementing tax practices that are largely allowed within OECD countries, and indeed in terms of the global rule systems. Here we are talking about profits generated being located in the lowest country tax regimes, such as also in tax havens and various other forms of tax avoidance. And this is set in the global rule system as much as it is within the OECD country rules. And so what we find is that OECD members are facilitating 78% of the tax losses globally. This kind of reverses the narrative of the loss of income in African countries being due to corrupt regimes and so on, to actually putting the attention, the focus onto a global system that is enabling this level of tax loss. And why is this important? Well, it's important for high-income countries. For example, if you take a country like France, well, it lost 4.6 billion due to tax losses globally. It contributed 4.6 billion to tax losses globally, but it actually lost 41 billion in tax losses itself. And this is money which is not going to the populations of that country that could be used for health services, for social care, for dealing with the consequences of COVID, the employment losses, the production systems, and so on. So this is affecting the people inside the countries of the North, but it's also affecting the countries in the South, that collectively low-income countries are losing 48% of their public sector health budgets due to tax losses, but don't have any say on these rules that are causing these systems, largely again generated more by multinational, transnational operations than by individuals. And if you look at the cumulative amount of tax loss, this could purchase and deliver 2 doses of vaccines to the global population 3 times over. So let's put this in perspective. OECD countries are contributing 8.7 billion. Well, they pledged this. The fact is they haven't yet contributed it, but they pledged it to COVAX as a system. But if they had addressed the 378 billion in lost tax, and if some of this lost tax had actually gone to countries where indeed the wealth is being generated, where the production is taking place, we would be looking at a totally different scale of financial flows that would be important for not just dealing with the intellectual property rules, but actually capitalizing the production systems that are needed to address the consequences of COVID. So why I'm raising this is that we actually begin to see 2 phenomena: a globalization of people as being an essential part of dealing with the consequences of the globalization of capital, but also the fact that we need to move away from financializing charity to looking at the underlying basic regimes by which wealth is taxed and used in our economies. So has COVID helped us do this? Where has been the focus of the response? And I think in the early days of COVID, there was a significant amount of attention on living and working conditions that were generating infection in low-income countries, in overcrowded housing, but also in high-income countries, in the kind of underlying ecological conditions. And I know you've talked about this yesterday, that's a lot that through monocropping, through single animal farming, through biodiversity losses that are pushing human populations into closer contact with animal populations, but also generating the possibility of viral transfers between them. And indeed, in the kind of social solidarity networks that pivoted to respond very quickly to COVID and the consequences for food security, for care, and so on and so forth. So we saw a kind of a generation of understanding of the underlying determinants around COVID. But we've also seen the opposite take place. We've seen biosecurity-driven top-down responses, often militarized responses, coming into communities to control people, seeing people as the problem and actually seeing control of people as being the basic approach. We've also seen that control taking place through digital means, a greater shift towards the use of digital technology in life, which has had consequences for example, for informal sectors who are not able to work remotely, for Black and ethnic minority communities in high-income countries who have not been able to work remotely, in those who are on more hand-to-mouth existence, but also in some of the privacy concerns about huge amounts of data being passed directly into corporate hands, and the way that is being used commercially. And indeed around a kind of silver bullet approach to the use of technology, biomedical technology, to control the pandemic without considering the underlying conditions that are allowing pandemics to spread. And here it comes on to what we found in our analysis. And the history of contestation between two fairly polarized different paradigms that have been informing our understanding of health across multiple centuries, in fact, dating back thousands of years. The first about the need to interrupt specific biological agents that are causing disease and a preoccupation with disease in pathogenic and biomedical approaches. And the second in understanding and improving the material and non-material and ecological conditions and engaging with the social determination of these conditions. When we looked in the historical trajectory of health as it's been understood in Latin America, in India, in East and Southern Africa, indeed in other parts of the world, and indeed in global discourse, in international discourse, we've seen these two paradigms contesting each other and achieving dominance at different points in time. So if we look, for example, in Latin America, some of the more holistic framing that we're beginning to move towards globally because of the climate crisis, but also because of our deepening understanding of social determinants of health, has in fact existed for centuries, pre-existed colonial regimes in these countries, in these regions. So in Latin America, in the Andean region, there was an understanding of buen vivir, or what was called suma causa in Quechua, excuse my pronunciation, which integrated the harmony across human, spiritual, and natural systems as a basis for well-being, and positioned people within their natural resources in terms of how the whole ecosystem would generate well-being. In East and Southern Africa, there was a concept of Ubuntu, a deep concept of reciprocity in relationships between community members as a basis for well-being. And indeed, in the relationship with ancestral spirits who were also manifested in the natural world as an important factor in well-being. And this was a really important point because the current individualistic modes of well-being, of personal care, of clamoring for resources, in fact, directly contradicted the whole notion of collective well-being that grew over centuries in many parts of East and Southern Africa. And then in India, the integration of supernatural, moral, spiritual, and material worlds in the various traditional systems that existed in India, that in fact generated in all three settings a use, an understanding of the natural world as a basis for well-being and of an interaction between human beings and the natural world. To some extent, this was reflected in European thinking by Aristotle, 300 BC in examining the material and non-material dimensions, and indeed in some cultures that grew and were suppressed in Europe that focused on natural resources. But essentially what dominated in Europe was perhaps the Hippocrates focus on external agents that began from 460 BC. And we saw this rising in this pathogenic biomedical paradigm, particularly driven by advances in scientific knowledge, in technology, and a notion of expanding medical care as a way to deal with disease. And in fact, an expectation that disease could be eradicated by technology and by what was termed modernization, a deep link between the fact that economic exploitation, including through colonialism, was the basis to drive the technology that would then eradicate disease. Now, this didn't go without its contestation. In Europe, Rudolf Virchow, Friedrich Engels, and others essentially pointed in a social medicine movement to the fact that these conditions, that disease grew in particular conditions, and that these conditions were indeed sociopolitically determined, and that dealing with health demanded sociopolitical remedies, not simply technologies. But what we did see over a period of many decades was a preoccupation, including in the international sanitary movement that was the precursor to WHO, of controlling disease risks to nation states and trade, particularly given that economies were seen to be the drivers of health in that respect. And also a focus for lower income countries with less resources on low-cost interventions and technologies that were selective for particular diseases and high mortality interventions that were seen to be emergencies rather than a consequence of chronic conditions. And we saw this most forcefully in the colonial and post-colonial application, using military, material, legal, and scientific power to suppress the ideas that existed that I described earlier, but also the local economies and the local systems, even while the expropriation of local therapies was taking place. And we understood how much biodiversity was used as a basis for modern medicine that was patented in the North. And we've seen this all the way through to the current debates around genetic material, the debates around that were consolidated in the Nagoya Protocol that was integrated into the international health regulations that kind of are the basis for governing relationships between states on health as one of the only binding conventions that the World Health Organization has, one of the only, which basically sets that states need to be able to give prior informed consent for their genetic material to be used, but that its use must be with fair benefit of that material. And I think that's generated debate around how this material has been used to patent medicines that have then not been made available in the South, and indeed to patent vaccines that have not been made available in the South. And this is still very much live today. For example, there are some debates around this pandemic treaty that's being proposed primarily from the European Union, but with some other countries supporting it, as actually removing the rights in the Nagoya Protocol under the framing of emergencies. So the expropriation has not stopped in the post-colonial period. But what it came with was a sense that allopathic Western biomedical approaches were superior and were modernizing. And for many post-independent countries, modernization became what they needed to do to develop. In other words, replacing decolonialism with development in this framework. And colonial public health laws that use forceful segregation of infected people and demolition of infected places, in fact, have remained in place in many, many parts of the South. We in Zimbabwe, and I was involved in the process, had to revise that law, and we've managed to pass a new public health law in 2018 to integrate things that did not exist in colonial public health law. The International Convention on Economic and Social Rights, the right to health and social determinants, as well as the understanding of primary health care and the participation and the informed participation of people in public health. So we're seeing these persistence of some of these types of approaches to public health, and of a concept that technology-driven interventions can be a magic bullet, ignoring social realities that even went as far in eugenic theories as sterilizing particular groups that were seen to be subhuman, and so on. All of this kind of is founded on the underlying concept that neoliberal reforms, economic reforms, would ultimately benefit health because the wealth from this macroeconomic growth would trickle down and be available for improving population health. And I need to say that these views were contested and have been contested throughout history. They've been contested through promoting socioeconomic and political rights and a concept of socioeconomic justice. They were contested in anti-colonial struggles, in socio-political activism, and in various redistributive policies that tackled causes. In Africa, in East and Southern Africa, around self-determination, but also around determination on the use of natural resources, which is an ongoing struggle in Africa around extractives and how they are channeling resources out of the continent and not making them available for health, including around food production systems, land grabs, generating monocropping and biofuel use and so on. And indeed around the whole idea in Africa of the adoption of comprehensive primary health care for health equity that has actually faced a continuous onslaught from more commercialized, privatized models of healthcare in our health systems and from underfunding of our public systems. In Latin America, we've seen contestations through the social medicine movement that was started by Virchow in Europe and came into Latin America and was even deepened by actors who became involved in politics, such as Allende, who introduced tax-funded national health systems, or indeed in Cuba, or in other parts of Latin America, in the Buen Vivir movement in Bolivia and Ecuador, that tried to look at the relationship, including constitutionally, between ecological, social, and economic well-being as a fundamental balance that had to be achieved in health to produce health. And in the intercultural approaches that recognized indigenous lenses on health and plurality as a basis for understanding interventions around health. And in India, in connecting health and social justice and democratic control, such as in the Gandhian movements around village health, and indeed in the social movements around people's health and people's hands, a notion that health cannot be produced without that kind of democratic control over the resources for health. And all of these movements underlay an understanding globally of a demand for a new international economic order, but also were understood at the time by World Health Organization and its director, Halfdan Mahler, to be a clamor for rights and a framework that could not be ignored, particularly in the context of a Cold War system, and therefore a demand on the conditions for creating a more comprehensive approach to primary health care, to health as a right and a resource for development, contradicting the notion that economies needed to grow to produce health, understanding that health and well-being was a central element to adjust economic growth, and indeed developing health in all policies, intersectoral health, and whole of society approaches. And we've seen this debate and trajectory take place across the whole history of the last several centuries, a to and fro between these different approaches, up to today, indeed, where we see a deepening global neoliberalism, austerity, as needing the fiscal rules needing to be satisfied in order for the health rules to be implemented, and a very significant shift towards a biosecurity focus, contested in movements such as planetary health or ecosystem health, by whole of society engagements in a more balanced approach to people's and planetary well-being. And I think we need to recognize that in different parts of the world, there is diversity around this experience, and that understanding that diversity is part of what moves us forward, and that we need models of circulation rather than models of hegemonic domination to be able to move to address these global challenges. Indeed, a different idea of global health that understands diversity in different regions, plurality, but that looks to the principles of what we learn by circulating our approaches to dealing with them, and also that recognizes the importance of contestation. And why do I say that? It's clear that we are in many multidimensional challenges that demand an understanding of diversity, circulation, and contestation. And the contestation of these challenges is an essential part of moving forward. Financial, ecosystem, inequality, mental ill health, pandemics, under-resourced public systems, social protection systems, conflict, displacement, migration, and exclusion. The crisis is inherent within our current systems of production and consumption, and that contesting crisis, the causes of the crisis, is an essential part of moving forward. However, ideas matter. The way we do this and the ideas matter, and I think we've seen this in the trajectory of different ideas around health, that the domination of ideas is an ascent, and the domination of discourse is part of what overrides or derives power or draws power. The ideas of healthy societies are as much sociocultural and political as they are technical and material, that they're embedded in histories, values, and polities that are different in different parts of the world, that they are used with material, political, and institutional and military power to oppose hegemony, but they're also challenged by social forces. And in fact, the way we understand and make propositions, affirmative propositions on the way we see the world and on the way we see health is very critical to tackling the drivers of the crisis, to the drivers of change, and indeed even on the language that's being used. And we've seen language of equity, justice being expropriated by others who have no intention to drive equity or justice. And this leads us to very different forms of knowledge, that knowledge is not neutral, it's value-driven, it's experiential, even when we're dealing with more specific technological forms of knowledge. And indeed, it will lead us to different futures. So why we need a circulation of ideas is that at this stage, listening is going to be critical, because in some parts of the world, and particularly in the South, there is more explicit statement of inequalities of income, of colonial conditions, of the underlying causes in the global economy that are driving these structural health inequalities. And we saw in the debate on inequality and the Sustainable Development Goals that it was many of the countries in the South that were driving a focus on inequality that would be more structural, that was then moved away from these issues towards simply dealing with the poorest of the poor. And here we see, for example, a report from PAHO. But also, and I'm moving towards finalizing the input, but also in the way we understand and defend comprehensive public health, an assertive model for it, in a discourse that does not allow public health to be reduced to biosecurity, that moves us beyond disease outcomes and insists on public health tackling conditions for social, mental, physical, and ecological equity and well-being, in the kind of agency that we exert on public health, that we move beyond the proximal determinants to keeping on tackling structural determinants, and indeed the socio-political determination, including in the institutions of knowledge, of public health agencies and of governmental action, as well as in our own institutions, in civil society and elsewhere, that we are constantly challenging what is not rooted in the public interest, and indeed that does not involve the public, and that we locate biomedical intervention within a wider framework of promotion, care, and protection and prevention, and that structurally we use public health to keep challenging the choices that are being made in production and consumption systems. So where to next? And I will close with some thoughts. So I've talked about how inequality is entrenched, how we are sustaining in these rule systems the historical power and inequities, and that this is undermining resources and decisions for population well-being across all countries now, for all people, that the wealth that's being generated is increasingly being privatized to a smaller and smaller elite. And it suggests a globalization of people being necessary as a part of the solution. That in that, we need to recognize this long-standing battle for ideas between narrow pathogenic approaches that are rooted in an argument that the economy needs to grow before the health can grow. That's been contested by more structural, social, and ecological framings that have existed for many, many centuries, and that this is reflected in our response to COVID, and that ideas and discourse are a form of power, with proposition, contestation, and understanding of circulation of knowledge as a critical dimension of building convergence of discourse, and that this needs to include in the discourse our agency and the structural dimensions of public health. Are we at a turning point with COVID? We thought we were. We thought we had a turning point in COVID. But when we look back at the battle for ideas, we see that turning points have been generated by multiple sources of power, of rule systems, and indeed by social actors. So where are we today? We have widening debate and deepening divergence between different ideas. We also have widening contestation over the institutions, rule systems, procedures, and resources, including, for example, on issues such as tax systems that present important fronts within which we should tackle our rights to health and social well-being and advance the discourses that we think are important. But I think I need to caution that crisis is inherent in our current global economy and is not sufficient. Indeed, after comprehensive primary healthcare was passed in 1978, we saw that food, energy, and debt crisis was actually used to drive a more neoliberal economic agenda and a more selective version of primary healthcare. So we can't rely on crisis. And what we need and what we see are the constant accumulation of conditions for and features of a propositional activism in society that is claiming the discourse on what will move us forward, as we have, for example, demonstrated in our understanding of comprehensive public health, and society that is engaging in propositions of where we need to act to make that happen in the institution and rule systems. And so I'll pause there. And as I've mentioned, there's a couple of papers that you can read to capture more, and indeed some of the more concrete ideas here. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rene Loewenson. This was a powerful, engaging story you were sharing with us. I have a few questions coming in, so I will read them for you. But maybe first, you sound, since we are globally being listened to, you sounded like the North needing to learn from the South, or is that exaggerating?
No, I don't think you're exaggerating. I think actually what I'm proposing is that a progressive community understands the circulation of ideas, that without question, there are ways in which the South has learned from the North. I mean, I talked about Virchow, Rudolf Virchow, and the social medicine movement moving into Latin America and being used in Latin America to deepen understandings of the social determination of health, and indeed setting up schools around social medicine, but also how social medicine was then transformed in Latin America and used to generate even deeper models of systems that have now created a basis for understanding intercultural health or buen vivir that have value for the North. So I think what I'm saying is that there are processes going on in the South, experiences in the South, innovations in the South that have deep relevance for the North, and indeed lenses in the South that need to be captured in the North, particularly as populations in the North are increasingly themselves being undermined by the nature of global capitalism. But that I'm not saying that it is a one-way flow. I'm saying we need to understand a model of circulation And within that, we need to look at the way our global systems are not allowing that, are homogenizing and dominating, and not allowing that kind of discourse to take place and change and create spaces for it. I hope that sort of helps to clarify.
Yes. I have a question referring a bit to the power inequality. The question is, moving from such a strong analysis and evident framework, how can we operationalize and fundraise this in practical actions by health and humanitarian actors? So I suppose humanitarian actors have to rethink themselves. What do you say?
Yeah, I'm interested that you use the term humanitarian actors, or that was specifically used in the question. So let me respond to it, because I think the first part of that is humanitarian actors, as I understand it, often come into where they perceive there's an emergency. But emergencies have deep chronic roots. And I guess the first point for humanitarian actors is to understand these structural roots to emergencies. And I think we've seen it in some of the analysis of COVID around its ecological roots, the inequality roots. And we saw the same in Ebola in West Africa, around the monocropping systems that allowed the transmission of disease and so on. So the first thing is to change the lens, that emergencies are not short-term and acute. They actually derive from deeper structural factors. And then I think in the power relations, because emergencies, and the questioner is correct, emergencies are often used to consolidate power relations and to dominate in situations of crisis. But I think we need to get to the roots and do the sort of sustained processes that need to be built. So moving from very short-term, immediate interventions alone towards looking at some of these causes, and then in power, looking at what generates power. So creating spaces for different kinds of learning and discourse to grow. For example, I would say there's discourse going on in WHO at the moment on looking at the kind of systems, health systems responses to pandemics that's not simply driven by biosecurity approaches. What can we learn from countries like Uganda that had more well-developed community-based systems that were able to respond more quickly to problems like Zika and Ebola than countries which didn't, and so on. So taking a systems lens, then a deeper lens, and looking at the social community systems as an inherent part of that. What do we learn about agency as a source of power? Whose agency? Why do we overstep national organizations, local organizations that are building long-term engagement with communities when people come in on emergencies and use very top-down methods, often through international agencies? Why do we not work through the foundation of what exists within those settings? So agency matters in power. And then structural matters, what I was saying, that humanitarian agencies have a role to play in not simply responding, but in actually pointing to the causes of these problems and being part of the movement that is engaging on the ecological and inequality-based causes that are leading to these pandemics. So not standing separate from those sorts of issues. So putting resources into those relationships, into those modes of action, and indeed into the knowledge and discourse that helps to drive it. I hope that helps to address a bit more concretely some of that question, and happy to engage further.
Yeah, is that particular word in the question, fundraise, still the right word to use?
I mean, funding, fundraising is in a sense a sort of a question that follows what you see as your basis for propositional action. So if the populations in countries where fundraising is taking place have a view of countries where emergencies exist as not connected to them, as problems that are short-term crisis-driven places, then I think the fundraising speaks to that message. So I think we also need to change the mindsets of the populations in the countries where fundraising is taking place. I think that's one point that I'd like to raise. And I guess the second point that I want to raise is that what I was trying to say earlier is that beyond the fundraising for acute, the sort of fundraising that's going on for these acute, such as the COVAX model. I do think that we have a responsibility to look into these global tax systems, because that's where the bulk of the money is going.
Yeah.
We're actually seeing the South, in fact, at a chronic level, funding the North, low-income countries funding high-income countries through global financial flows, illicit and licit financial flows. So I do think we need to start moving beyond models that are simply dropping small amounts of money into the South and actually tackling the large flows that are coming out of low-income countries. And that means engaging with these global rule systems. I really think that we must stop. We shouldn't stop doing these kinds of support, but I think we mustn't make that our sole means of activism.
And see them in perspective. Thank you for that answer. Marlon Lopez says, to solve the ecological problem, it is necessary to set limits upon accumulation. This is not possible with capitalism. It keeps ruling the world. Is ecosocialism the political way to go?
That's an interesting question. I think that there is no question that we need to change our current mode of production, consumption, and wealth accumulation. And there are some very, very interesting papers that from Latin America, for example, from Africa, and indeed from Europe, and in fact, even from North America, that point to this, that the current mode of production and consumption is destructive. And there are debates about what to do about it. Ecosocialism is inherent, in fact, in some of the discussions that are taking place in the South. And where it's happening is being deeply attacked. And I think we have seen countries that have sought to try and move from extractive modes of production and consumption being pulled back into these modes because of the economic rebuttal. So I think in order to move to a different mode of production and consumption, we also need to move to a different mode of civilization globally. And in doing that, we need to look at the kind of global architecture that's stopping countries from generating more plural ways of dealing with their economic conditions. If a country like Ecuador wanted to reduce its dependency on extractives, it needs to have the political and economic space to do that in order to move towards a more social redistribution of production and consumption. But it doesn't have it in the current global system. So I think it's a question of how you move there. And part of that means deeply challenging the tax rules, the patenting rules, the trade rules that are currently governing some of the possibilities that countries have to move towards this more eco-socialist models, or indeed other models that enable a better balance between ecology, people, and material well-being. I mean, there are degrowth models, there are more multidimensional models. I think one of the most important things is to not be in a situation that, say, Zizek described, where it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of the current capitalist, neoliberal and capitalist mode of accumulation that is currently causing our existential crisis.
Yeah, blame it on that and problem solved. It's not that easy, is it? Do you see global social movements coming together to reach that critical mass for policy change? Sorry.
Are global social movements coming together?
Yes, are they?
I think, I mean, you have a conference where you're bringing this together. So can I say yes? Because I think there are so many spaces where this kind of dialogue is taking place and where it's being articulated. I understand there was a Eurodad conference. Recently, there are food conferences that are taking place. There are conferences within which, or processes or movements within which equity in technology is being debated. All of them are saying similar things, that we must all clamor for each other's demands, in a sense, that we must talk about debt cancellation. We must talk about the tax regimes. We must talk about the ecological systems. We must talk about public health systems and public health systems not being privatized. So that there is a kind of a sense of converging dialogue taking place.
We must
Are we overcoming fragmentation? Probably not enough yet.
Okay. Interesting question here. Shouldn't medical products be products of public good instead of being a commercial good? Shouldn't health be a public good? It's more a statement than a question.
I mean, health is a right. And as a right, as a fundamental human right, the right to the highest attainable standard of health, which all of our countries have ratified, it has to be a public good. As to medical products, I think this is the debate which is currently taking place in the WTO TRIPS waiver. When public health overrides, when public health takes precedence, then the products which are essential for public health must become public goods. But I think, and certainly in our region, in East and Southern Africa, and I think in many other regions, what we are looking at is not simply the distribution of those public goods, but actually the production of those public goods. That we want to see the ability to control innovation, to have research and development as a public good as well. So it's not the end product alone, but the ability to generate the product.
Yeah.
And where we see patents as being a barrier to that, we think that should be changed.
You recognize the diversity of the different views on health systems worldwide. However, do you see a common base that is needed for healthy societies globally?
Yeah, I think the common base that really emerged for us when we were working on the paper was this question of not making human beings the sole purpose, and then, of course, for some, not making material growth the sole purpose, but actually looking at what existed in some of these early cultural systems of a balance between our ecological, our human, and our material well-being as a kind of a state of harmony or balance that we need to begin to achieve as reflected in our production, consumption, social, and rural systems. And I think for me, that's been a real important contribution to health. And it's interesting because the WHO Constitution talks about health not just being the absence of disease, but a state of social, mental, and physical well-being. And I think we're now saying it should be social, mental, physical, material, and ecological well-being. So bringing that together. And for that, I think we have to move away from this medicalized model of health that's come to dominate globally. And in fact, has infected our ministries of health as a pandemic, a biomedical model that simply says health is equal to the absence of disease, and really begin to challenge our governments around this more balanced approach of this balance between ecological, material, and social well-being, psychosocial well-being as well.
Can that be an innovative way of thinking, or do you speak more as a defender of go back to the past?
I'm not talking about going back to the past. I'm talking about learning from the past. In fact, I think countries in Latin America have gone back to recognize the historical and cultural roots in order, like Bolivia, for example, in order to think through how they then take these forward in the context of the 21st century. But there's no question from the current struggles around climate, around planetary health, around social determinants of health, that some of our past thinking needs to be asserted, but in the context of what we are currently facing in the 21st century. So whether we do it through our debates around commercial determinants of health or around our food systems or whatever, it's thinking through this balance between those dimensions that for me is very important for health.
Allow me to thank you very much, Rene Loewenson. It was a very inspiring starting of the day. Thank you so much.